Good morning, and welcome to TAO's next session of our Member Resiliency Series, the Oregon Legislature's Coronavirus Response with State Senator Arnie Roblan. I'm Skip Newberry, CEO and President of TAO, and a couple of rules of engagement before we start. All participants have been muted, so please remain on mute unless a member of the TAO staff calls on you and asks you to talk. You may ask or respond to questions in the chat box, publicly or privately, by directing your message to Justin Martinez or Kara Snow, and we'll monitor the chat box throughout. We'll ask you all to engage via the participant icon on your screen, and please engage with us on social media during this call and throughout the day. We appreciate all the social support, so if you take a screenshot of myself and the Senator chatting and share that, we'll be sure to reshare it as well through our networks. We also, due to the limited time, will capture all questions in the chat and shift any unanswered questions to our online community engagement platform, which is called Mobilize. It's TAO's member-only virtual community, and we'll post any unanswered questions there. If you have any questions about joining Mobilize, please feel free to reach out to Justin, whose email is on the screen. And if you have any questions about joining TAO, please reach out to membership@techoregon.org. TAO staff support is provided by Kara and Justin, who are happy to take feedback, answer questions, comments, or discuss sponsorship opportunities. In partnership with Free Geek, the business community is hosting Tech Now, a series of contactless drive-through technology collection sites across the Portland metro region that will end later this week. Employers are encouraged to share the campaign with their employees and customers, and the general community is also encouraged to participate. A huge thank you to AT&T and Portland State University for underwriting this series. We appreciate their support. Please join us on Friday, June 5th for our next session with Portland State University President Steve Percy. He'll be discussing higher education resiliency. It's my pleasure to introduce Senator Arnie Roblan of Coos Bay. Prior to his service in the Oregon State Legislature, Senator Roblan was a math teacher, dean, and principal at Marshfield High School and received the Milken Education Award for excellence for his work in preparing a generation of our young people for the challenges of the future. Thanks for joining us today, Senator.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So diving right into questions, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what the initial days of the pandemic response looked like at the state, and what were some of the things that Oregon legislators were focused on to keep Oregonians safe.
Yeah, it was a really strange time. We had just unsuccessfully had a short session with some of my colleagues leaving the building, so we didn't have a quorum. So it was a very frustrating end to that short session. And so there was anxiety amongst people, and then the corona hit, and the governor decided to use her executive powers to start trying to figure out how are we going to deal with this new pandemic and this new once-in-a-lifetime crisis that was happening in Oregon. And at the very beginning, the Speaker and the Senate President had made a decision that we probably needed to get into a special session. We needed to figure out what was going on. And so, for maybe the first time ever, rather than the governor calling us in, the Senate President and the Speaker decided to put together a new coronavirus joint committee. And in so doing, they called a few of us, asked me if I would be willing to be a co-chair of that committee, along with Representative Holvey out of Eugene. And I said certainly. It was not really what I had intended to do, as this was my final session. I'm not running again. And so as I thought about it, I thought, we have a big task ahead of us. We're going to have a committee made up of Democrats and Republicans, some of whom had not finished well the last time. How could we show the people of Oregon that we are a united group most of the time, that we get along, that we can have conversations about very difficult topics, and we can do that respectfully with each other. And so that is what we determined to do. We had two Republicans that were kind of our senior members from the Republican caucus, Senator Boquist in the Senate and Representative Stark in the House. And so we started having conversations. I encouraged leadership to have other conversations at the Senate President and the caucus levels with our Republican colleagues, because we needed to first show that we could have these kinds of conversations. We were given a list of things to think about, and I would say that for the most part, Senator Boquist and I have been in the legislature the same length of time. He came to the Senate before me, but we started out in the House together. So we had a long relationship. And Senator Holvey, Representative Holvey at the same time came in that same group with all of us back in 2005. And so we started having conversations to try to figure out what should we be talking about, where do we need to go. And I think it was Senator Boquist who actually said, you know, really what we have to do is focus on Maslow's hierarchy. We've got to take care of food, shelter, and security. Those are the three things that are really important if we're going to have a short session at the beginning of this whole thing and bring legislature in to have a conversation about resources and what we could do. So we did that. We started having those conversations. We had a lot of things on the table that were probably more midterm or long-term as opposed to short-term. And in a week, we came together as a group of legislators and came up with recommendations that we forwarded to the governor, the speaker, and the Senate president, anticipating that we would have a fairly rapidly called short session. As you can see, we have still not had a short session, so it was not something that happened quickly. The governor did take almost all of our recommendations as a roadmap for the kinds of things that she could do with executive power, and many of them were implemented. We then recognized that as the money was coming in from the federal government, we needed to have conversations about how that money could be spent, where it was going, how those packages were coming to the state. It turned out that we had about 46 different streams of money coming from the federal government. Our LFO worked with the governor's office to try to figure out how all that money was coming in. We started to recognize that we were going to have to figure out, again, what the state's response would be given the response from the federal government, because you don't like to spend limited money that we have in the state and then not have it be able to be reimbursed from the federal government. So figuring out how that money was coming was really, really important. And we had a lot of people working very hard to try to figure that out. So then it became clear that we weren't going to have a special session probably until after we had the forecast, because we needed to figure out what was really happening in Oregon, what resources do we really have, not what resources did we think we had. And so we needed to wait for the May forecast. And in between, we could have some meetings of our emergency board. And for those people who don't know, emergency board is made up of Democrats, Republicans. The Senate president and the speaker are the chairs of that committee. And when a session is not in progress, the e-board has access to some funds for us to distribute, and we can make decisions and work with the executive branch to give authority to spend other money that comes in from the federal government. So we had a meeting fairly early after our group got over. We spent some of the about $75 million. We had about 25 million of it to shore up the kinds of things that the governor and the leadership had decided were important. That meeting went reasonably well early on. We then had another meeting later on when we had identified that there were certain aspects that couldn't be funded from the federal money, and that resulted in another short special session. We spent another 30-some million dollars of that. So we have about $18 million left right now to spend on those things. In order to get more money in the emergency board to function in other ways, we have to have a special session. And we also had conversations about the type of special session. There are two types of special sessions in our statutes. One is what we normally think of as a special session. We as members have to come to the building, at least a quorum of our members, 20 of the senators, 40 of the House members, in order to actually do business. And then we can do business like we would in a regular session, and we can pass bills, we can look at budgets, we can do all those things. The other kind of special session is one that we set up a number of years ago. I think it was around 2007, between 2007 and 13, around the whole idea of a subduction zone earthquake. What if we couldn't all get to the Capitol? How do we get to run government if there's that kind of an emergency. So it's a special session. The governor can call it only once in an emergency for a limited duration, about 30 days. And so it's something you want to use very judiciously, especially in a crisis like this one that we know can continue to linger on for a long period of time. Most people agree until we get a vaccine, it's going to be difficult to open up completely. So that conversation went on. I think the general feeling is that it should be, and in that special session, the special session, you can actually meet remotely. So we can do it by phone and Zoom meetings. We're using Teams at the Capitol for running some of our meetings. So we also made a decision because we'd already passed some legislation to allow us to have committee meetings virtually. So we have been having over the last 2 weeks, last week it was the House, this week it's the Senate, are having our interim committee meetings. So we're getting information to figure out where we go next. Yesterday morning, I had a 3-hour team meeting with my committee on mental health and looking at the issues with respect to mental health around this one. So we are starting to have lots of those other meetings. I also had a meeting yesterday with the Invasive Species Council, which I'm a member of, the State Fair Council's meeting. All of these different groups are meeting. So state government is continuing to work forward as we get ready. We've had a conversation that we may have another e-board meeting this week to start talking about what to do with some of that CARES Act money. We have about $550 million in reserve, $530 million in reserve. So deciding how that could be spent. We also are having conversations about having a special session towards the end of this month. It hasn't been agreed upon. And as most people know, in order to really have a successful special session, the leaderships have to meet and agree on the kind of the parameters under which we're going to work and where we're going to be going. I'm also the co-chair of the subcommittee of Ways and Means on Transportation Economic Development. So I have been working on that committee. The governor has a blunt instrument. She can cut across the board all of her agencies. She has told them to look at cutting 8.5%, which is a biennial number. So for the last year of that biennium, it's about a 17% cut, which is pretty drastic. We, the legislature, are the only ones that can cut it line item by line item. So we have been meeting on a regular basis, the subcommittee chairs with our LFO people, to try to go through each of the budgets that we're responsible for and see if there's better, more surgical budget cuts we can make to come up with those same numbers. And we were asked to look at 5, 10, and 15% cuts, which means up to a 30% cut for the second half of the biennium. So those are the conversations that are happening right now, and that's what's been going on a little bit. Not a lot of particulars, but kind of the overall functioning of the state government as we sit here today without a special session.
That's great, and I think you also were able to cover a bit of sort of bringing us up to current times, and then also hinting at kind of where we go next with a potential special session later this month. And as we think about, you mentioned the Economic Development and Transportation Committee. A lot of folks are really, at least from the business community, right now focused on the recovery period. And so as we start to move into that and folks are bringing more people kind of back to work, and you alluded to the fact that this is an ongoing crisis and, you know, there could be additional spikes and other waves. In what ways is the state trying to think through some of these issues? You mentioned some of the continuity and planning going on to keep government operating, but what are some of the big issues you're hearing from constituents as we move into the recovery period? Yeah,
that's been a really interesting part of this new part of my life, dealing with my constituents in this arena. The biggest one that's kind of consumed all of us, and you saw the big changes in the employment department. Getting it figured out and getting people checks. We've still got thousands of people who have not received a check or a payment. And that's been frustrating for all of us. We have a list each legislature of people who have called us, and we're trying to do it. They've come up with a new criteria and way of doing that. Hopefully we will get that better under control. But right after this started, the governor decided she needed some expertise to help her decide, you know, what are the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. What do we do in those kinds of stuff? And so one of the first acts she made was to set up a advisory committee on an economic advisory committee. And so that group, both Hovey and I were assigned to it as the representatives from the legislature. And we've been meeting once or twice a week since this began. And it is made up of a lot of the people you would know, many of the representatives from industry and business and unions and all of those people. And we sit in a meeting and have a conversation about what kinds of things are they hearing? What are their memberships interested in knowing about? How do we do this safely? She also put together a medical board so that everything that came out of our committees had to be reviewed by them to see if it actually would stand up to opening up correctly. As one of the conversations that first happened between Senator Boquist and myself was the idea that, you know, if we're really successful in this and the governor makes the right calls, we're probably going to not see that as big an effect as other places. And everybody will say, hey, this is overblown. We didn't really need to do all this. And if we failed to meet what we should have done, and the virus got out of control and we had lots of deaths and lots of infection all over the state, they would have said, see, they weren't able to do anything. So it was a lose-lose to begin with in that committee, in the sense that if we did what I think the governor did right, was really get in control of this on an early basis. And so, as you know, we're one of the lowest infection rates in the country. Our number of deaths is one of the lowest in the country. We have done a really good job, and we have to give a lot of credit to Oregonians in general. When it came to staying home and staying safe and doing the kinds of things and shutting down, the governor, I thought, started out pretty well too, in that she didn't close down everything. She closed down those things that clearly helped lead to spread. Our restaurants on the coast, we got really wiped out because tourism was pretty much canceled. All the parks were closed, restaurants, bowling alleys, all of the kinds of things that we do. And when our hotels closed in the northern part, and she didn't do that, but the counties did, because of the big influx that came in spring break, Washington, Portland, all came over to the coast. And that was when they first started getting their cases on the coast. And we realized how clearly we could take care of ourselves, but if we get a big influx of people, it's hard to take care of ourselves. And that's when we first had peace officers getting sick, in large part because they were going out to meet with people and problems and different things that happened, and they got exposed. So counties took drastic action. The governor's economic advisory group gets advice from our regional solutions group. So all around the state, there are regional solutions groups that are meeting to bring up the information from all of our businesses and others about what we can do and how we go next and where we can go. In my area, I have 7 counties, and each one of those groups of local government is having their own Zoom meeting. So I'm meeting with people from Yamhill a couple times a week, from Lincoln County, got a meeting later today with them. Coos, Curry, and Douglas have a group that we meet together on. So we're having those meetings as well with local government, trying to make decisions as best to protect their citizens. And so how do we weigh the economics of this whole thing with the public health of the whole thing? And I think the governor put teams together to help inform her. She also has an economic an advisory group made up of economists, and she let us have a preview of that this last week, where we all got to listen in as the economists talked about what they foresee after we had our forecast. And it was interesting to hear them have conversations about whether we should spend our reserves or not, whether we should understand that the next 2 biennia are going to be pretty tough as well, and so should we save that? They weren't all united on those conversations, just about like all conversations, but the full gamut. I think the 1 or 2 things that came out of that conversation was that they really believed that both education and health needed to stay at the forefront of what we do going forward. If we can't keep the virus under control, we'll have to close down again, and that would be really disastrous. So how do we ease into this kind of stuff? And I think we've done a pretty good job. This first 2 weeks of the 3 weeks of phase 1, we haven't seen big spikes. We've seen a little bit here and there. And so I think it's going forward pretty clearly. We're looking forward to June 5th when phase 2 is supposed to start with those counties that have put in their proposals to do their phase 2 and see a little bit larger gatherings, some other kinds of things. And then we're really waiting to see what happens in the international community and coming up with some kind of treatments that work and or a vaccine. So that's kind of how all of that stuff is happening.
That's great. One thing that was interesting in sort of learning a little bit more about your background was just as a former educator, I'm wondering if we could get your thoughts on one of the bigger issues that we've seen for businesses has been with their employees. Many of them are now, also not only doing work from home, but also helping with kids' schoolwork as we've gone completely virtual. And I know that many of them are looking to the fall and saying, what are the prospects for sending the kids back in person versus not? And I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on where you see some of the bigger sort of challenges as we try to navigate this crisis on behalf of our students across the state as it relates to the education system.
Yeah, I got involved in that fairly early because of my background. I used to be the chair of education committees, and as speaker, we were really in, when I was in the session that had a tied house, education issues came up a lot, and we had a lot of conversations. So I have been having conversations with Colt Gill and with the Lindsay at the governor's office about education in general. When the first conversations came out about doing a pass-fail system for those kids at the end of the session, I looked into that and tried to figure out if that was happening around the country. It was in a lot of places. It made sense to me. I talked to my Republican colleagues and explained to them that, it's really difficult. We have a lot of problems, and a lot of people are saying we should shift all over to online schooling. That I don't think we had the capacity to do that. So figuring out how to supplement what our school districts were doing and help them survive, because we don't want, if we shifted all the money away from all those schools, our local school districts would go bankrupt in a very short period of time. So one of the things that schools did in our state and not very many other places was say, look, we can maybe be the childcare place for essential workers and others. We can figure out ways to social distance and take care of kids. And so that happened throughout the state. We appreciated that extra work. In a couple of weeks, all of the teachers were told to figure out how to make packets of material. We would continue to feed kids, and if they could come to the school grounds, we would be able to have meals made and get those distributed. They could also distribute at that same time packets of materials for kids to turn in and bring back and forth so teachers could keep them on track. Identifying all the kids was difficult. I mean, finding where they were, how they were living. We have homeless kids that are also in the same mix. So there was a lot of, how do we make sure that we're giving everybody, if not equal chances, opportunities to keep up? And that's a really tough job. I'm also on the Rural Telecommunications Committee that's working on trying to get broadband everywhere. We have a number of schools that still don't have it, and some of our libraries don't. So how do we make sure that kids have access? So if we're starting to move to online, how do we get them the ability to have online? And there's a number of places, and you don't have to go very rural to all of a sudden find that. So you can be just outside of Portland in the wrong place and not have access to some of the what you need to do that. So all of those were being taken into consideration about how do we make sure that all kids are getting an opportunity to continue their education and finish it up. I think that interestingly enough, in my conversations throughout this pandemic, I think there is a growing new appreciation for teachers, especially for young kids whose attention spans are not as great as some of the older kids, and keeping them on task and trying to get them to do their work is not as easy as people may have thought. When they have a class of 24 of them, it's pretty amazing actually that teachers are as successful as they are. And then moving up into the high school, we have a lot of parents who really can't help their kids with advanced math or advanced science. And so how do we make sure that kids continue to get those deals? I think there will be an asterisk in this generation of kids about this pandemic year and getting graduation. As you see, there's a number of different kinds of opportunities for graduation ceremonies, and those conversations have been happening. I will say that in each of my meetings that I have with our county governments and our local people, education comes up all the time. It has become a major factor. A number of our local people are educators, and so they bring that with them as mayors and as county government people, and trying to show what they're doing and how they're trying to interact with kids, figuring out how to bus kids when we come in the fall, so that they can still have social distancing, making sure that people are wearing masks, because that's proven across the world to be a real success story in keeping the spread down, not for yourself, but for the other person. So I keep reminding people, we wear masks to protect the other person, not ourselves as much. And we need to remember that we are a society where we do count on each other to be helpful. And education is one of those things that all of us are working on. I have been talking with online programs that we have in our state, and I've had a long history with charter schools and having conversations to figure out what kinds of things could they lend to our students to help them. We have in my district the Adelphian school. They basically said their kids, if you go home, you can't come back. So they kind of are sequestered on a hill outside of Sheridan, and they're doing a great job of educating their kids in that environment. But there's not many of those kinds of places out there. So over and over again, people are trying to make the best out of a very, very difficult situation. And I am pleased with Colt's conversation. We're going to have a conversation with some other online supplements, the Khan Academy. There's other places that I have been dealing with and talking to and trying to figure out how do we integrate some of the stuff and help our teachers, give them the skills they need to be more successful in doing some of the things that they can do online. I have some grandkids back in Maryland who are, their parents are starting to try to figure out their first graders doing online schooling every day, and the amount of time can be a real challenge. And keeping kids' attention in those situations to a screen is not necessarily an easy thing. So it is a big issue, and to truly reopen more efficiently in the fall, we're going to have to figure out how to get kids back into schools at least part-time. So there are big conversations going on across the state about split schedules, half the kids coming one day, half the kids coming the other day, so you can distance them and do some other kinds of things. But I will tell you, it's going to be a challenge for administrators with kids keeping social distance and having conversations in classrooms about how we move forward. So, and as we find out more and more about this disease, which a lot of people thought were just going to affect people like me, older, people with underlying health conditions, we're finding it is affecting kids and others, and we don't really want to see those kinds of things take the lives of any of the people in Oregon that we can help. So, thanks. It's a big challenge. I will tell you, I have been very impressed with people stepping up across the state. We have 197 school districts, and I think people don't understand. We don't have a school system. We have a system of schools, and each one of those 197 school districts have their own superintendent, school board to make lots of decisions. We give them resources, money from the state, but how they spend it, what they put together, how they organize themselves, the number of teachers they hire, all of those things are really left up to the schools and the school districts. The other issue that's coming up is we just passed, as you know, the Student Success Act. We've had conversations about that, the CAT tax, all of those other kinds of things are a part of the conversations that continue to go on. I hope that revenue is being open with respect to how people make decisions about whether they have it to pay or whatever. But even in our conversation in the committee early on, we have some companies, especially national ones, that have never paid any tax to our schools. Targets and Amazon, now that they're selling into our state, they do have to, and they've been doing reasonably well. So we're hopeful that some of that resource will help as we come back to keep schools going and to solve some of the problems that we've intrinsically had. And you know, one of the issues that is exploding across the country right now with this George Floyd issue is something that when we were out student success, we heard in every part of this state the discrepancy between different subgroups of students in our state and how we weren't being as successful with our black and brown kids, and we need to fix that. And major part of what we had put into the Student Success Act was how are we going to even the playing field for all kids and get them what they needed so they can be successful. And we can't stop that. We can't change. I've been on a couple meetings with regard to that. We've got to make sure that we take the vision of what we had decided and what we'd come up with as we went across the state and implement those things. We can't build back the system that we had before. It wasn't serving all Oregonians the way it should have. So we need to learn from those things and encourage school districts to make the difficult systemic changes they need to make sure that every child that walks into their schools, whether they're poor or rich, or whether they're black or brown, or whether they're white, have equal opportunities. It won't be the same. Some people need more than others, and we've got to be able to support those things so that every child can reach their potential. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Senator.
My life's work, which has been education.
Well, that's an important point, and I think a nice way for us to kind of leave our audience with a remark on a very timely statement about what's going on right now, not only in Oregon, but around the country, and sort of the importance of education in that. So we want to thank you, Senator, for spending some time with us. We know you're incredibly busy, and also thank you again to AT&T and PSU for their support for this series. And thank you to everyone who took some time today to spend with us. If we didn't get to your questions, and thank you for those, by the way, we will be sure to send them to the Senator and his team and try to get some responses for you in a reasonable period of time. So thank you all, and thank you again, Senator.
Thank you. We'll work on that.
Thank you.